Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're stitching circles into one of our spinning square blocks, and this can be a little tricky because of those seam allowances we're dealing with this block. However, I hope to share a lot of tips and tricks to maybe make this a little easier on your home machine. So let's get started. So here's our quilting design that we're using for our spinning square block. And if you're looking for this guide, you can find it in the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com. Okay, so we've got all these circles working our way around the block. Notice how much empty space we're leaving. We're leaving our center square open. If you're struggling to quilt over that t-shirt fabric or whatever fabric you chose to put in that center square, this is definitely going to be designed that makes that at least easier. We're also leaving a lot of these triangles open, but we're going to be filling in these areas with these circles. And the struggle we're going to have, and I've already stitched a few of these so I already know, all the seam allowances press outward this way. So in this situation you're going to have seam allowance along that edge, but no seam allowance as you stitch the circle. You're not going to have seam allowance underneath the fabric there. So you're going to kind of go from an area of kind of density and intensity right here to an area of no density and intensity right here. And that can kind of wreak havoc a little bit with the circles as far as the feeling of it underneath your hands. So let's get on the machine and I can give you some tips to keep that under control. So here we're on the block and I've already stitched several of these. As we get into the smaller circles, they do get a little bit easier, but notice how I stitched kind of off the line and out of the area a little bit myself. So this is easy to do, and don't get too nitpicky or obsessive with it. If you stitch a totally imperfect one, remember my tip, fill it with the spiral, and that's a good way to hide it. Okay, so I'm going to get started, and I really like going from the bigger circles down to the smaller circles. I think that that's helpful, mostly because you can kind of go from that bigger size and then just start shrinking them down. You go from the smaller circles, those smaller circles were much harder to mark, and you might not have as accurate a placement. Okay, so basically what I'm doing, swinging down and around and up. Oop, I just stitched out, that's okay. I'm going to leave it, not going to worry about it. And now I'm coming down and around. Now I'm headed for an area of an intensity, and I know that. So what I'm trying to do is slow down my machine with my foot pedal and still guide it kind of almost forcibly with my hands. I could feel that really slow down my machine, but that's the best I could do when it came to stitching that circle, and it's really more of an oval. If you stitch one and you're just really upset about it, go inside and fill it with a spiral. That's just stitch in, come into the center, and then work your way back out again. And that's a good way to hide it, a circle that's not quite perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to travel stitch along that edge and swing up and out. I really like that up and out motion, and then I can kind of come down and around into that area of density. And what I'm saying about that area of density, what I mean is there's just like 3 layers of fabric you can't even see because of the seam allowance being pressed outward. There's 3 layers of fabric underneath this part, whereas there's none over here. So that's what I'm meaning. Even though you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. So now I'm going to swing down and up. A slow, steady pace is very important for this, but notice how tiny my stitches are. I'm not going to rip any of this out because, well, it would be really difficult to rip out. These stitches are really tiny. I need to probably get more control over my foot pedal and slow down even more because my hands are just not moving very fast today. And that's partly the block and what I'm working on, and that could also be just I'm feeling like moving a little slower today. These smaller circles are just a small minor movement with your fingertips, and notice how I'm keeping my index finger here right against the side of the foot, and that helps me kind of pivot off the side of the foot and control the block so I don't swing out wildly. Okay, from here I need to do a little bit of ditching along some of these lines, so I'm going to take care of that and speed up the video so you can see how I move through the block. Okay, so here's the situation. I have these circles to fill, obviously. I've got this stitch to stitch along and this stitch into the corner. And I really want this to be secure since there's no quilting here at all. So how I've decided to do it is I'm going to go on ahead and stitch down into that corner. And this is black fabric on black fabric. I have trouble seeing exactly where that ditch is, but remember, we're going to cut these blocks down to exactly 8 inches, and this edge will be covered with binding. So it's not a big deal if you stitch off the line. Okay, so now I'm going to do this stitch coming back up. And I do find ditching, when the seams are pressed to one side, I do find ditching more challenging, just simply because, you know, you're running up against kind of the edge of a hump of fabric, and when you stitch off, it's really noticeable. You can see that right there. When it bothers me too much, when I really feel like I want to rip it out, I grab a pen. Actually, I need to grab my Sharpie. There's my Sharpie. Yeah, I grab a Sharpie marker and just color it out. Let me back up the camera. I've shown you this before, but just to reiterate it, if you're really feeling obsessive about it and you jump out of that ditch, just color it out, and that will be permanently covered and kind of hidden, so no one will know. Okay, so now I've got these circles to fill. I'm going to go all the way down to that corner. So a little bit more travel stitching and start off the corner. And as I'm stitching, I'm focusing on the feeling of the quilt block underneath my hands. I'm going to have to just react and adjust to anything that I feel. The foot pedal, the presser foot seems to suddenly not want to move, suddenly feels a lot of resistance. I can also listen and hear it. When my needle is piercing many layers of fabric, it will usually make a lot louder sound. So as I stitch these, I'm stitching on the line. I've marked this set of circles, but you know, you can also stitch this freehand. You do not have to stitch this. I found it a little tricky to mark these because of all of the seam allowances, because of the density, and also, well, because the circles changed shape. Some of them were big and some of them are small, and they were a little tricky to mark. So if you want to stitch these freehand, next I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. Hopefully you could hear right there where my stitches just really sounded, you know, you could hear a kind of a thumping sound almost. And of course my circle is now a little wobbly, so I am going to fill that one with a spiral. And even stitching the spiral feels a little challenging in that one. There's just a lot of stuff going on under there. Even with the issues and the mistakes that I've made on this blog, I still love the effect of the design. I still love these bubbles. You know, I consider them kind of bubbles around this cute little embroidered piece in the middle. This was a baby garment, and I just think that the bubbles really set it off and make it look nice. It's one of those things where the quilting design was more or less influenced and inspired by the piecing or the fabric panel that I chose to use in the middle of the block. So that's another idea. If you have a lot of baby clothes that you've saved and you don't really know what to do with them, or you don't have anyone to pass them on to, making a little quilt of all those baby clothes might be something fun to do, and then you can come up with fun ways of quilting it with, you know, bubbles and hearts, and you know, we've learned how to stitch cursive words into a quilt. You could write the name of the baby, you know, all of that kind of stuff I think would be a really cool way to make a quilt that's just really special and unique. Okay, so we've got one little line of ditching here to finish up, and then I'm going to freehand those circles into this section, and this is going to look very different from the circles over here, the circles that we've marked. This was planned out, planned in advance. You know, I planned to cut that circle off. Over here, I'm going to just stitch this freehand and just see how the circles fill. I'm going to stitch down into this corner, so that way I'm working off the narrow space. I'm not even going to try and make these look identical to what I designed before. I'm just going to stitch these the way I kind of want to stitch them. I even want to put a little tiny circle right there. Oops. I kind of stitched into that one, so I'm going to fill it with a little spiral to make up for it. As I make mistakes, I just throw more thread at it. That works. Okay, this time I'm swinging out and around, making a bigger circle to fill in that area. I kind of like that movement, so I think I'm going to come up to that area, and I kind of have to mentally space this out. This is a pretty big circle I'm going to be putting here, and if I don't space it out right, I could really make a big mess. So I'm going to actually grab a marking pencil, and I'm just kind of eyeballing it. This is, you know, there's no rule. There's no rule that says that you have to mark your quilt before you baste it or before you're actually quilting it. I can actually sit here with the needle down in the machine and rotate the block around and eyeball a circle and just mark where I think it should go and go from there. That's perfectly fine. You know, sometimes it's actually nice to just kind of mark on the fly. I don't mark everything when I'm quilting, but if I really want something to be placed properly and exactly, I will grab a marking pencil, because I could not have stitched that as perfectly without those marks in place. The rest of these should be fairly easy because I'm kind of stepping down gradually as I fill this space. So I'm going to come down. I've talked about it a lot this year. Visual estimation. I'm kind of visually estimating, well, what would be the midpoint of that circle and trying to stitch around it. I think that one's a little wonky, just ever so slightly wonky. I think I'm going to fill it with a spiral just for fun. Hide your mistakes with spirals. I think that's that's advice that needs to be put on a t-shirt. Okay, there we go. This time I'm actually going to mark just the center spot for where I think the center of the circle would be. And then now this turns into more of an echo. I'm kind of echoing and pivoting around that. Ooh, that's an area of density. Notice how I had to slow down and kind of almost force the block around that area. That's seam allowances. But notice how that center dot became kind of a pivot point to echo around, and that circle came out a lot more accurately. So let's do that again. I'm just kind of visually estimating. Where this should go. And as they get smaller, I don't usually feel the need to mark it or mark a center dot. That might come in time for you. The more you do them, I do know that this was stitching circles even with the dot or even with the marked lines. It's a tough shape, so don't hesitate to fill ones that you feel bad about. If they're a little wonky or a little oblong, fill them with spirals. It really does hide the kind of iffy ones. So that's it. I'm going to basically just fill in these other corners the exact same way. And here's what it looks like whenever I finished this block. So that's it for stitching circles in one of our spinning square blocks. I love this design because I think it's beautiful, and I think it really went well with the piece of fabric I was showcasing in the center of the block. However, if I had to stitch like 50 of these, I would really be tearing my hair out. The circles are challenging to stitch when you have all of those seam allowances from the paper piecing. It is challenging, and I made some big stitches. I stitched some wonky circles. Notice how many spirals I stitched into this block. That was hiding mistakes. So I encourage you to find ways that you can hide your mistakes, whether it's filling a circle with a spiral, or it's maybe even turning the circles into that design underwater rocks. We learned this in a previous block where you take and just overlap layers of thread in really erratic echoes and travel stitching, and you hide your mistakes, and you also add an intense amount of texture with thread. I think that's beautiful, and I think that that's definitely another option that won't have that nitpicky perfectionist kind of thing going on. we've kind of got two sides with this block, and this is kind of fun. With our first design with the straight lines, we had a lot of nitpicky perfection. With the second design, stippling, we were able to wiggle around those areas that were dense and intense and just avoid them. And with this block, we've kind of gone back to really an exacting design where we had to stitch in the ditch and we had to fill these circles in and watch out for all those seam allowances again. So keep in mind, there's many approaches to quilting your quilts, and I certainly want to encourage you to start looking at the quilts on your shelf, quilts that you've already pieced. If the seam allowances are pressed to one side, they are going to cause you issues. No doubt about it, they are going to cause some issues in the quilting. However, there's many ways that you can quilt it without it being too bad, too difficult. You know, stitch stippling over that quilt and you can avoid those things, avoid those spaces. So keep these things in mind and start building those skills to look at a quilt and say, you know, this is the best way, this is going to be the most efficient way for me to quilt this with the least amount of headaches and the least amount of stress. No one wants to stress out about their quilts. So I hope you'll keep all of those in mind and definitely start quilting more quilts on your own. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and join us as we learn how to quilt 42 beautiful blocks, as well as learn how to piece them. Pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.